Everyone, this is Cassandra, and if you're tuning in, I am going live. Great. Ugh, I might have to move. I've been having problems with my internet connection lately, which kind of sucks, but whatever. So anyway, my name is Cassandra. Some of you may know me as Iyapo. I'm also called the Rogue Black Girl. So today is Friday. It is about 2:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And just like I have been trying to be disciplined 3 days a week, I am back to continue the reading of the Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth. Christina! Yeah, the Great Cosmic Mother. So, So we are on, the last time I read was 2 days ago, and we were in the middle of the chapter entitled Denial of the Mother, Denial of the People. So for those of you who may be tuning in late, again, this is the Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth by Monica Zhu and Barbara Moore. We are on our way to the end. Come on, man. We are on our way to the end. There are 52 chapters. We are on chapter 46. We stopped halfway through 46 2 days ago. So we're going to finish chapter 46 today and continue with chapter 47. And for those of you who are tuning in on IG, I'm having some wonky connection issues. So if I drop for whatever reason, I am still reading live on YouTube. So you can go to my YouTube channel, which should be listed. I changed it today, but it should be listed as Cassandra-Floyd. If not, Iyapo Ngina. Iyapo, Iyapo Ngina. I'll be reading there live for 1 hour today. Okay. In the meantime, if you have your books, get it out. If you got your highlighter, get it ready. Okay. So we're picking up on page 323 of chapter 46, which is entitled Denial of the Mother, Denial of the People. So let's see. There were also widespread beliefs in the coming of a female messiah. Well, we just come on right out the gate swinging then, don't we? Probably this is why Joan of Arc was eliminated as a secular and divine rival of the church. She was a favorite of the people. Most of these groups and movements were wiped out by the Inquisition or driven so far underground they gave up remembrance of their beliefs and customs. But their psychic heirs continue to spring up everywhere and always, even to this day. Significantly, they always spring up among the people, the poor, the young, the outcast, the women, the minorities, the mad, the artists. And they are always seen as a threat to the established patriarchal order. Rightly so. They are the children of the Great Mother struggling to regroup. To the ancients, all things and events perceived by the senses and the intuition were interrelated, differing manifestations of the same ultimate fluid reality. The cosmos was one and inseparable, and the notion of the isolated individual self was an ego illusion, to be transcended by ritual ecstasy and Kundalini meditation. This was the natural holistic vision the Christian Inquisition and the witch fires tried to burn out of the eyes of Westerners. Ironically, the Inquisition's excesses so disgusted men of intelligence that they were turned away from the church altogether, they turned away from the church altogether, repudiated religion, and began to build a holy secular world on the smoldering ashes of holy fires. Oh. From those fires rose Francis Bacon, calling for the truly masculine birth of time. The patriarch of experimental philosophy, as he was dubbed by an admirer, Bacon inaugurated modern science in very explicit language, calling for an aggressive male attack on nature's secrets always a metaphor for female genitalia. Come on. Bacon saw what he termed an engine of thought, the machinery of the scientific method that would allow men to interrogate nature with power, to put her on the rack, thereby uncovering the hidden processes and secrets of excellent use, still laid up in her womb, end quote. Such metaphors were not accidental. As Bacon lived and wrote, the engines of the Inquisition were working methodically around the clock, interrogating nature in dungeons via the naked bodies of women accused of witchcraft, interrogating all European life with the religious judicial powers of torture and fire. Although Bacon argued against the prosecution of witches on the grounds that their confessions were too fantastic, i.e. unscientific, to be believed, it is very possible that he himself, as an Attorney General of England, was involved in authorizing arrests, trials, tortures, and burnings of accused witches. Brian Eastla, an English mathematical physicist and critic of the masculinist orientation of Western science, referred to Baconian thesis as a prospective game of the female nature. Logic and science and the connection between the two. All right, so the rationalist control and exploitation of natural process launched by Bacon's method in the 17th century would lead to the birth products as a substitute for life. This was all the enlightened European male mind could retrieve from Christianity's devastation of the original holism. To what noble end? In Bacon's words, quote, I am come in very, very truth, leading to you nature with all her children, to bind her to your service and make her your slave, end quote. Bacon was followed by Rene Descartes, whose extension of the theological split between mind and matter, spirit and flesh, into the realms of physical sciences provided the intellectual whip for such an enslavement. Mind and matter become two entirely separate spheres, one alive and one dead. This Cartesian division allows scientists to treat matter as wholly inert stuff, completely separate from themselves, and to see the material world as just so many isolated objects assembled into a huge machine, a machine that worked in the cosmological sense through the the sheer logic of its rigging. There was nothing inwardly alive left in Descartes' theoretical universe. As Carl Stern thought, there is nothing childlike left. There's nothing childlike left in the man's gaze. The hand of wisdom, Sophia, the maternal, is fully rejected, and a proud intellect lays claim to omnipotence. As Stern also points out, Descartes' mother died in childbirth when he was a little over a year old, and his brief life was spent in physical frailty and melancholia. Intense grief was at the core of Cartesian dualism. He combated an ontological sense of loss with the precise tool of rationalization, which rendered everything dead but his own mind. And in this was a living symbol of Europe, which was killing its own ancient great mother with persecution and fire, and would find itself with nothing left but cold ashes in its own masculine mentation, and all the fabulous little machines it was about to construct as a substitute for the truth of living flesh. Ooh, come on. Newton was a master of the mechanical worldview and made it the foundation of classical physics. Made it a foundation of classical physics. From the 17th century to the end of the 19th, this word as machine philosophy dominated scientific thought and was a model for much social and religious thought as well. A logical, technocratic God rules from above through the personal law of Newtonian had little trouble with this God who functioned as a perfect machine, doing no magic miracle tricks and demanding no devotion beyond the application, now and then, of drops of cerebral oil. Woo! This enlightened way of looking at the world profoundly influenced all Western thought until quite recently. Western man has created his identity is to control the body while experiencing itself as something separate. This is how Rene Descartes handled his grief, and this is how Western man handles his. A method that causes an incredible fragmentation and alienation within the psyche, as well as in the organic world surrounding it. Come on. Literalism, a wholly linear logical concept of time and evolution, was already inherent in the biblical worldview, which pitted Hebrew historiocracy against the cyclicity of the pagan Neolithic goddess religions. From the 17th century onwards, European linealism developed as a rational faith in progress, which is an evolutionary accumulation of goods, property, material products, knowledge, techniques, determined by the manly will of God. Man could fancy themselves totally emancipated from the body of the great mother. Or didn't they have, didn't they have the steam machine? Didn't they have calculus and factory production? Real men were above fate, and the imaginative energies of the soul were put away as childish toys. Nature was henceforth to be the docile handmaiden of the logical mind. Oh my gosh, the man with the know-how, that famous Western know-how which has given us, among other things, a good deal of the social, ecological, and spiritual catastrophes and crises of our modern world. As Foucault discovers in Discipline and Punish, the sciences of nature were born to some extent at the end of the Middle Ages from the practices of investigation developed by the Inquisition. The inquisitional technique that 500 years of continuous sadistic torture bodies, minds, and spirits of primarily women, that Inquisition, which Foucault calls that immense invention that our recent mildness has placed in the dark recesses of our memory, became the scientific technique of experimental investigation, baby. Oh my gosh, I may have to stop. I do not know what is going on with my connection, but it looks like I am frozen on my YouTube live, which is distressing. Y'all didn't hear that last sentence though. That was like that was a punch in the face if you didn't catch it. It says, as Foucault points out in Discipline and Punish, the sciences of nature were born to some extent at the end of the Middle Ages from the practices of investigation. Investigation developed by the Inquisition. The inquisitional technique that 500 years of continuous sadistic torture of the bodies, the minds, and the spirit of primarily that Inquisition Foucault calls that immense, listen, man, that immense invention that our recent mildness has placed in the dark recesses of our memory became the scientific method of mental investigation. Whoosh. That is heavy. That is heavy. Honey, they traded the Inquisition for the scientific method. That's all he's saying. Come on. Man. I don't know if anybody can still see me on my YouTube, but anyway, okay. These sciences of man, which have so delighted our humanity for over a century, have their technical matrix in the petty, malicious minutia of the disciplines and their investigations. These investigations are perhaps to psychology, psychiatry, pedagogy, criminology, and so many other strange sciences what the terrible power of investigation was to the calm knowledge of the animals. Okay, great. Thank you so much. My YouTube person. Thank you so much. Okay. What the terrible power of investigation was to the calm knowledge of the animals, the plants, or the earth. Another power, another knowledge. The Christian Inquisition held on the human being was to be a scientific inquisition held on all of nature. Held on all of nature. What was done to the humans was about to be done to all of nature. Okay? To the analytical end of turning both nature and human being into useful machines or functions of the machine. Notorious Western discipline began as a Christian monastic technique, not a discipline of witness, of seasonal rhythm, of internal bodily rhythm and cyclicity, nor a discipline seeking illumination through the body's kundalini spinal energies. No, Christian monastic discipline was a rigid and deliberate program of anti-naturalness, aesthetically and punitively pitting the spirit against the body, against the ancient flesh. Child, y'all better act like I'm taking y'all to church in here, okay? Come on. In my discipline, and punitively. These are secrets that are being spilled to you right. Once established a timetable that was ideologically hostile to the moon, sun, seasons, and stars. It was based instead on the Christian mind's idea of how mortal flesh was to be straightened by forcing it to go against its own biological inclinations. Oh, come on, I have a word for y'all one of these days. I have a word for you one of these days about the very thing. This monastic timetable and ascetic practice soon spread to the institutions controlled by the church, the schools, and the poorhouses. These vulnerable populations were to be the first European citizens outside of the monks themselves to feel the systematically biophobic lashes of God on their brains and backsides from dawn till dusk. The young, the poor, the powerless, they were the ones who needed straightening. If the body was punished enough, it would be thereby weaned from nature. Weaned from nature, and then the Christian spirit could bloom glorious submissiveness. So successful were these monastic programs designed to turn human bodies into obedient machines. They spread during the 17th through the 19th centuries into the large commercial industrial manufactories of Europe, in which the factory routine was strangely mingled with pious observation. Quote, the vigors of the industrial period long retained a religious air. In the 17th century, the regulations of the great manufactories laid down the exercises that would divide up the working day. Quote, on arrival in the morning, before beginning their work, all persons shall wash their hands, offer up their work to God, and make the sign of the cross, end quote. But even in the 19th century, when the rural populations were needed in industry, they were sometimes formed into congregations in an attempt to inure them to work in the workshops. The framework of the factory monastery was imposed on the workers. To the profit of someone, we may be sure. The monastic routine was instituted further in hospitals and prisons and achieved its ultimate success where we could predict it would, army life. And the Swedish Protestant armies of the 17th century, military discipline was achieved through a rhythmics of time punctuated by pious exercises. Bozanel, who wrote the Swedish handbook for the Christian mixture of prayer and war, believed that the military had the cloister and the cloister should share the same perfection. Through such methods, the state perfected the trick of getting rid of the peasant and giving him the air of a soldier. In the same way, industry turned the worker into the tool by getting rid of the human being. Thus, monastic discipline, the Christian practice, and urge to free the spirit by subjugating the body was institutionalized throughout the Western world. And thus, it led directly to the mechanization of the body, the human being turned into an appendage of the machine, a servo mechanism at work, play, love, and war. The spirit was never freed in this process. Needless to say, it continues to share with the body in what Foucault calls a subjugation that has never reached its limit. It has never reached its limit because the exercise of subjugation itself, the chronic submission of the human to the system and mechanization and the mechanism of such discipline, has become a function of profit, i.e., of world power and domination. The Protestant spirit added greatly to this process by rationalizing worldly profit as a function of Christian spirit. The fundamentalist Protestant tautology, Protestant tautology that wealth is a sign of God's favor because God wants you to be rich, is a perfect machine. While it grinds out the profits of morality for the many, it gathers in the morality of profits for the few. And thus, Christian capitalism, where God becomes a kind of shrewd world banker in the sky, exchanging souls for dollars and dollars for souls at a terrible rate of exchange. Foucault describes the design and construction of 19th century panopticon. I don't know what that is. Panopticon. The symbolic utopian building of the Christian capitalist West, designed by Jeremy Bentham. The all-seeing building was based on the needs of prisons, army camps, workhouses, and factories for constant control via perpetual surveillance. Come on, y'all. The perfect disciplinary apparatus would make it possible for a single gaze to see everything constantly. A central point would be both the source of light illuminating everything and the locus of convergence for everything that must be known, a perfect eye that nothing would escape, and a center towards which all gazes would be turned. God damn. This is the eye of God, the God who is an eternal prison keeper, the voyeuristic judge of morals, Big Brother. The purpose of such a building and such a God is, in Foucault's words, the hierarchical observation. And we must remember that hierarchic comes from hieros, meaning sacred. And its And in its first political structural usage, it referred to the positioning of the patriarchal priesthood as the agents, spies of some remote god in authority above the people, above the people, over the people. God's police. This all-seeing structural eye of God quickly becomes the all-controlling structural eye of prophet. Man, y'all better act like y'all hear me. Can I get somebody to send a whoop whoop or a hands up or something? Y'all better act like y'all hear what I just said. Come on. Man. Shit. This was the problem of the great workshops and factories in which a new type of surveillance was organized. In the large factory, everything is regulated by the clock. The workers are treated strictly and harshly. Clerks who are using them with an air of superiority and command, which is really necessary with the multitude, treat them with severity or contempt. But although the workers prefer a framework, a guild type, to a framework of a guild type to this new regime of surveillance, the employers saw that it was indissociable from the system of industrialization, private property, and profit. Marx had seen it too. This is a quote by Marx, quote, "Surveillance thus becomes a decisive economic operator, both as an internal part of the production machinery and as a specific mechanism in disciplinary powers, a kind of fascism of the eye, perpetual necrophilic control through the total structural surveillance was built into the nervous system of the West many centuries before Hitler appeared, baby. The West made progress, quote, progress through its willingness to turn the body into a disciplined tool, use the body as an obedient machine part, and its construction of a religious, political, economic machine, which via constant visual policing of the body's movements, work movements, sexual movements, social movements, ensured the success of this mechanization process." Oh my God. Success, i.e., the introjection, its internalization, a majority of its people. Today, in the modern West, mechanical surveillance is almost wholly subliminal, just a part of life. Employers, social agencies, government institutions, political and military leaders rely on constant technological surveillance as, one, a method of maintaining control, and two, a method of gathering information needed to enforce the control. Workers and citizens have been almost perfectly conditioned to its use, i.e., few people ever question its normalcy. This book was written in 1987, by the way. Pornography is a panoptic function. It is everything watched by a mechanical eye. With all our modern media of life, in fact, photography, cinema, television, video games, the entire West, almost the entire globe, is wired as a panoptic system. There are few places one can go to escape the perfect eye, single gaze, which is modern electronic surveillance. Optics is the genius of the West, and voyeurism its major mechanism of control. With the spread of global and multinational corporations and construction of free trade zones throughout the third world, and soon the undeveloped ghetto neighborhoods of America, economic, political panopticism will be complete. Free trade zones, which employ 80% to 90% women workers at substandard wages, often housing them in prison-like dormitories within the zones, are surrounded by cement walls, usually topped by barbed wire. The women are under constant surveillance, not only at work, but on their off hours for their moral and political behavior. It's becoming standard practice for even well-paid high-tech male workers in America and other major industrial countries to wear computer sensors on their bodies throughout the workday. These electric sensors record the speed and efficacy of the body's work movements in relation to each task. sweat, skin activity, pulse and heart rate, muscular tension, and reaction time are all recorded by the eye of God, baby. Because the West was arrogant enough or insane enough to believe that its anal eye was truly the eye of God, its will to total dominance, truly God's will, its perpetual machinery of observation and control, in fact, the machinery of God, it made progress. Western leaders, the political, religious, and economic elite officially merged their prophets with God's prophets. And the Western people's condition consistently and grindingly from the 13th century beginnings of the Christian Inquisition to accept submission to this profitable machine as their moral lot in life, baby. The patriarchal denial of the mother becomes the political denial of the people. Y'all ain't heard. Y'all ain't heard. Thank you, Yashara. Yashara, I like that name. Yashara, thanks for the shout out. I needed that, okay? I need to be standing on a pulpit right now. You feel me? Anyhow, the patriarchal denial of the mother becomes the political denial of the people, which becomes the total mechanization via capitalization of the human body. And as the body moves, so does God move. The biblical capitalist West has created God as a prison keeper, as a factory boss, rather than a living cosmos. God as an assembly line, rather than a dance. And this mechanical God and the mechanism of this God has been wired into the nervous system of systems of generations and generations of people. Foucault says, at the heart of all disciplinary systems functions a small penis mechanism. Indeed, the penal eye of God, that single gaze, oh shit, that single gaze, that mechanical single vision of the punitive profiteering father. Whoo, shit. That is that is the end of chapter 46. So we're going to go on to chapter 47. Dang. Oh my God. Chapter 47. This is a banger. The American split. Americans are frequently told, especially with the resurgence of television, evangelism, and fundamentalist politicians, that America is a Judeo-Christian nation. Judeo-Christian nation founded on biblical principles. Such a statement easily passes by all those Americans who don't know much about our own history, and most of us don't. The English Puritans who first arrived to colonize America were highly biblical people. As Max von Demont points out in The Indestructible Jews, these Puritans regarded themselves and were known in England as Hebraists. They took the Old Testament as their model of government. And once America modeled their new homeland upon the Old Testament principles. Though nominally Christian and worshipers of Jesus, social and political effect, it was the Old Testament that served as the ideological matrix of the laws and customs of the Puritans, or the Puritans attempted to live by in the New World. The Puritans were highly influenced by the Old Testament concepts of a people chosen by the biblical God to exert his will, especially to lead the rest of the world to righteousness. Demont writes, quote, "It was the Roman Christians who with sword in hand converted the pagans of Europe, thus bringing their first names beyond." In 6 main languages taught there were Hebrew and Latin. State language. When women and some men were accused, brought to trial, and executed as witches in the colonies, it was by these Puritans, who were thus interpreting Old Testament injunctions against the Neolithic goddess religion as a colonial mandate to destroy New World witchcraft and paganism. For these Puritans, the New World was very much the biblical world of Yahweh, and when Americans began pushing at western frontiers, clearing land of forest and Native Americans, all the way to the Pacific, it was the Puritan Old Testament concept of manifest destiny that fueled their drive to the west. That fueled their drive to the west. As DeMont says, quote, though the political power of the Puritans was broken in 1800, their ideology became American ethos, end quote. This Puritan ethos worked its way into fundamentalist belief and Protestant capitalism in general. A profound conviction that the political establishment of America, and later its political economic hegemony over the entire hemisphere, perhaps someday of the entire world, were manifestations of God's will, a divinely mandated national destiny. The Puritan religious power was broken in 1800. It was broken or blocked or rechanneled by the second major influence on American life, the secular power. Who and what was this secular power? The founding fathers, as they are called, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, James Madison, Ben Franklin, et al. The men who wrote the documents and espoused the ideas leading to the break with Britain and the American Revolution. The men who wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and in general established the legal, political, ideological matrix that became American government and American ideals of freedom and independence of thought and behavior. The founding fathers were not Christians. They were deists. Deism was an 18th century rationalist philosophy emerging from the European Enlightenment. Deists understood God to be the principle of organization and intelligence in the universe. This ordering principle could be discerned by rational thought and investigation, but it was not a personal deity who could be petitioned by humans. Deists considered themselves to be decent and spiritually devoted men, but when they said God, they referred to cosmic law, not to God of the Judeo-Christian Bible. Some deists, including American deists, spent a good amount of time and energy criticizing and refuting the superstitions, dogmas, and rituals of the organized Christian churches, both Catholic and Protestant. The major premises of Christian religions are deists totally oppose these two basic Christian principles. Instead, they espoused the 18th century philosophy that defined human beings as 1, essentially good, and 2, capable of progress through knowledge, reason, justice, and liberty. Deists denied the dogmas of the virgin birth, the divinity of Christ, the concept of heaven and hell, and all the ideas of damnation and redemption. Deism was, in fact, the origin of what we now call secular humanism. And it was the practicing philosophy of the men who conducted and won the American Revolution and became the, quote, founding fathers of American government. The European Enlightenment, of which deism and the American Revolution were important elements, was a reaction against the historic collusion of the court and church, which had made a bloody debacle of European history. The American deists lived on the still raw edge of 5 centuries of Christian Inquisition and perpetual sectarian warfare in Europe. The historic ravages of persecution and scapegoating, the arrests, the tortures, burnings, and daily terror, the confiscation of the property as well as the life of anyone accused of heresy or witchcraft. These nightmarish events were still quite alive in the minds of men like Paine, Jefferson, and Adams. The Inquisition and witch hunts were the recent history of their people. This is why they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in precisely the way that they did. The First Amendment was not a philosophical abstraction. It was an attempt by non-Christian men to structure a respect for religious freedom of belief or non-belief, along with a strong legal control over any church's ability to condition the minds of American citizens with the alliance of the government. The two prime virtues for deists were liberty and knowledge, for white males like themselves at least. Any church-state amalgamation threatened liberty and knowledge, which they rightly saw as enclosed in a mutual feedback system. One needs the other for the other to exist. The American deists were just one generation removed from a Europe reduced to spiritual and intellectual rubble by the power partnership of the church and state. They wanted to prevent that from happening in America. They wanted the new world to have a chance to be new, for white men like themselves, at least. Another strong non-biblical influence on the American Constitution came, of course, from the original inhabitants of this continent. The great law of peace of the Longhouse people, known as the Iroquois Federation or the League of Six Nations, is perhaps 1,000 years old and still governs the Longhouse people of Northeast America. In nations or tribes whose languages to one the deistic founding fathers were aware of this great law and impressed by its to this degree, the Constitution is a true and organic expression of the original American pagan spirit, deriving not from the Judeo-Christian Bible's pastoralist moralist, nor yet strictly from European rationalism, but from the indigenous, earth-oriented Indian consciousness of this land. Come on. When Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man," end quote, he was referring to his deist God, the God of liberty and reason. And the tyranny he referred to was religious tyranny. Jefferson expressed admiration for the principles of the gospel Jesus, but he did not believe these principles were exemplified by organized religion. On the contrary, difference of opinions is advantageous in religion. The several sects perform the office of consensus morum over each other. Is uniformity attainable? Millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burnt, tortured, fined, imprisoned. Yet we have not advanced 1 inch toward uniformity. What has been the effect of coercion? To make one half of the world fools and the other half hypocrites? To support roguery and error all over the earth? Reason and persuasion are the only practicable instruments. To make way for these, free inquiry must be indulged. Oh my goodness. As for the biblical God, Jefferson described the Old Testament Yahweh as cruel, vindictive, capricious, and unjust. Thomas Paine spent a good part of his adult life fighting the Bible, its God, and its ideas. This is what he had to say about it. Quote, "Whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and torturous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness with which more than half the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we called it the word of a demon than the word of God. It is a history of wickedness that has served to corrupt and brutalize mankind. And for my part, I sincerely detest it, as I detest everything that is cruel," end quote. Come on. Louis Michel, one of the heroines of the French Commune who was exiled from France after the Commune's defeat, wrote in her memoirs, quote, Throughout the world, there are too many minds left uncultivated. Between those who know nothing and those who have a great deal of false knowledge, those warped for thousands of generations by infallible knowledge that is not correct, the difference is less great than it appears at first glance. The same breath of science will pass over both, end quote. This was the spirit of the time, the spirit of post-Inquisition Europe, when freedom fighters saw clearly and spoke eloquently against the tyranny that had for so long been exercised, not simply over the human body, but over the knowledge-seeking human mind and the freedom-seeking human spirit by the collusive powers of the church and the state, baby. People were seeking knowledge, liberty of inquiry, reason, science as the way out, the way over the hideous, tyrannous gray wall. Thomas Jefferson, the American deist, was writing in the same spirit when he deplored that, quote, religious slavery under which a people have been willing to remain, who have lavished their lives and fortunes for the establishment of their civil freedom, end quote. But as Jefferson, Madison, and other deists saw, there were many people who were willing to risk their lives fighting for physical and political liberty, who then turned around and submitted their minds to religious dogma, to spiritual tyranny. Jefferson and Madison constructed the First Amendment to allow such people a freedom of religion to do so. But they intended the same amendment to absolutely prevent them or any church from imposing such mental and spiritual tyranny on anyone else. Because of their absolute insistence on a separation between state and church, because of their deist beliefs in the innate goodness of human beings and the evolutionary value of reason, knowledge, and liberty of inquiry in the development of a truly human consciousness, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, James Madison, George Washington, and all the other American founding fathers could be justly called the first American secular humanists, the same type that is now being called by fundamentalist preachers the enemies of America and those who want to destroy the American way. This strange reversal occurs because the fundamentalists identified the American way as the way of the Puritans, those pre-revolutionary English Hebraists who were indeed trying to live out the mandate of the Old Testament on American soil. But the Puritans did not conduct the revolution or write the Constitution that established the American government. This American way, the way of Paine, Jefferson, Madison, and the Bill of Rights, was the way of non-Christian deists, of men whose positive influences were not the Bible, but the European Enlightenment and the very secular works of Voltaire and Rousseau. The secular humanist way, in fact, which was not the invention of 20th century liberals, feminists, and other atheist pinkos, but was officially born with the birth of the American Constitution. As many of us were growing up, humanism was not a dirty word. It meant a generous concern for the liberty, well-being, and growth of an entire human community. It meant a rational acknowledgement of the fact that human beings build the human world. And if we build it greedily, fanatically, or stupidly, we will end up suffering in it. During and after World War II, it meant everything opposed to Hitlerism, Hitlerian, this woman in her words, Hitlerian fascism, and Stalinist tyranny. And in a naive but well-meant way during those years, human meant the American way. For the past 2 decades, however, Christian fundamentalist preachers and ideologues have been trying quite loudly to redefine humanism as something un-American and even evil. In their definition, secular humanism means putting humans at the center rather than God. And they insist that this human-centered society is to blame for all the world's crimes, violence, disorder, and general unhappiness. Socialists and many other people would argue that the modern Western world, led by America, is not humanist but capitalist, and that at its functional center is not the human being but the dollar. And and that it is not secular humanism but capitalist exploitation which is causing so much of the world's violence, degradation, and destruction. Further, when we look at examples of the societies that have put God at the center, what we see is appalling. We see 5 centuries of European Inquisition. We see the witch hunting obsessions of our own colonial Puritans who were not above torturing small children until they testified against their own parents. We see Nazi Germany, led by a crazed necrophiliac who proclaimed he was finishing the work of the Lord as a work of mass extermination. We see contemporary Iran ruled by, quote, holy men who are executing 7-year-old children and lining their streets with the hung bodies of traitors against God. No human being, no preacher, no holy man, no church can put God at the center of life. God is already there. We choose to perceive or not to perceive this fact. No one can put God anywhere. God is already there. What the fundamentalist preachers and self-appointed holy men mean is that they are going to put some man's idea of God at the center, an idea that is born of the inflated egos of these preachers and holy men themselves. It is never to God, but to men's ideas of God, and to the swollen egos of God's self-appointed policemen on earth that millions and millions of human beings have been torturously sacrificed in all the God-centered societies of the past 4,000 years of patriarchal earth. In all true religion, approximation to God is revealed by a steady growth of wisdom and peace. In false religion, approximation to some man ideas of God is always signaled by increasing fanaticism and bloodshed. The God so many contemporary fundamentalists of any religion want to put in the center of our lives is in fact a regime of total tyranny established by mortal men in the name of God and in name only. The first American secular humanists, the founding fathers, and in particular Paine, Jefferson, and Madison saw this problem very, very clearly because they were children as well as students of European history. They were also children and students of American colonial history and had observed how quickly the old inquisitional mind had flared up in the New World and the habits of the Puritans. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights were their attempts to save America from becoming one more God-centered tyranny ruled by holy men with a terrible bloodlust. Woo! Woo! Come on. Come on. There's a stream in North American life. It was never really and the rational humanist deism of the Constitution writers. An underground stream, that of wildness, of sensual innocence, of paganism. Many Europeans did to America with a desire to escape civilization, a civilization of constant inequity, harsh morality, and warfare, and return to nature. America was an entire hemisphere of pure nature. Not a few European men, this stream was mostly male, did return to wildness in America. They joined Indian tribes or became frontiersmen, exploring ever westward until they hit the Pacific Sea wall. Some of these people were just blindly running to the straightened life. Blindly running from the straightened life. Others were consciously pagan. This underground stream emerges as a real American dream, a peculiar lust for innocence, which is always sought, never found. This pagan American search was never for the Puritans' moral God or the deist rational God, but for the time of paradise before God, the garden of beasts, trees, and human souls living in harmony before Yahweh, Christ, and Astarte. There is a kind of generic memory that such a time did exist, and America briefly seemed a place where it could be refound. In 19th century America, there were many Edenic or utopian experiments in communal living, fueled by a dream of communal harmony and personal ecstasy. But the twin gods of morality and rationality always seemed to prevail, either breaking up such communes from within or barreling down from without to drive them out of town. The great American tradition of normality has always been a public device for controlling and exercising these lurking demons and dreams of personal wildness. Behind every lynch mob, every cross burning, every racist attack on the dark other, as behind every social snobbery or blight, rule of exclusionary etiquette, is a rationalist Puritan terrorizing his or her own pagan heart. Whoop! Oh, shit. Come on. Listen, behind every lynch mob, every cross burning, every racist attack on the dark other, as behind every social snobbery or polite rule of exclusionary etiquette, is a rationalist Puritan terrorizing his or her own pagan heart. Normal people fear this wildness so much because it is always there, indigenous not only to this land, but to our own pre-biblical roots. But our conscious returns to the pagan, our conscious returns to the pagan have been sporadic and local. Bohemian, beat, and hippie communities in America have attempted it. Such attempts have affected and changed our lives stylistically and politically, perhaps more than we know, but never for long enough or inclusively enough. The paganistic return to nature is like the Buddhistic salvation from the world wheel. Nobody really does it until we all do it. North Americans, more than any other people on earth, have a hard time returning to our roots because for most of us, our roots are elsewhere, buried under hundreds of thousands of years of the man's history. We can never return to the garden of harmony and ecstasy until we know how to pass through those two fierce angels blocking its entrance: moralism and rationality. Woo! Shit. Come on, man. Come on. Listen. Oh my God. And we can never get through those patriarchal door gods until we remember whose garden it really is. Just as much of the rigid Puritanism of Protestant fundamentalism can be traced to the biblical Old Testament, so a good deal of Catholicism's historic misogyny and zeal to convert can be traced back to the New Testament St. Paul, who was himself a fanatic convert and a fanatic misogynist. Throughout European history, there were periodic attempts by people who saw themselves as Christian radicals to break up the grid of the Old Testament and St. Paul on the established churches and over the Christian mind. These people chose to follow the gospel image of Jesus as a radical social reformer, Jesus as a social revolutionary. The Templars, the Beggars, and the Beguines, the Albigensians, and the Carthari, and so forth, all tried to practice what they understood as gospel communism or gospel communism, a naked and ecstatic sharing of food, goods, and mutual care. Some of these medieval Christian communes tried to practice sexual equality. Some extended their communal practices to the sharing of their bodies. Others maintained strict marriage fidelity or practiced celibacy for Gnostic visionary purposes. All were accused by the church of social spiritual heresy, including orgiastic sexual behavior. They all ended up at the stake. Many of the experimental communes in 19th century North America were composed of similar radical Christians trying to live out their interpretation of the Gospels and of the Jesus image as a call to return to communal living and ecstatic, non-possessive behavior. Within a Victorian society that valued the accumulation of private property and wealth as a moral duty, the North American communalists practiced a sharing of shelter and all material goods and daily activities. Within a Victorian society that covered piano limbs with crocheted cuffs, so it was not forced to see or even say the fact of legs in a society that had more brothels per capita than any other society on earth, the radical communalists practiced either free sex or strict celibacy, with marriage partners living as brothers and sisters. These communal experiments in North America, like the hippie communes of the 60s, were marginal and elitist and middle class by necessity. Uh-oh, y'all ain't heard. There was no way for them to reach or affect the lives of large numbers of people, or to radically change the values and structure of the larger society. All of these communal or utopian experiments of Europe and North America, Christian or otherwise, saw what they considered to be social greed and injustice and sexual hypocrisy and repression practiced in the name of God and Christ, and they counteracted it with radical experimentation, i.e., radical going to the root. Within a Christian capitalist context, radical social experimentation always means 1, communal living and sharing of food, 2, sexual freedom and equality, 3, practice of visionary ecstatic techniques, both communal and individual. Many of these communalists have called themselves the true Christians, or considered their experimentations to be closer to the Christ's gospel intentions than the normal lifestyles approved by the church. But in fact, such revolutionary communal experiments are always a reversion to pre-Christian pagan social and spiritual structures, even though they sing and dance to gospel texts. Within a Christian capitalist context, radical Christian behavior is always a re-emergence of paganism. And this is why it is always opposed and crushed by the church. Regardless of what the Gospels may say about the lilies of the field and spiritual poverty and the virtues of not possessing wealth or worldly power, the Christian church, both Catholic and Protestant, has grown with and firmly established itself upon the practice of private property, and its existence is functionally embedded in a hierarchic framework of social classes based on wealth. The wealthy and powerful uphold the church as a major instrument of social discipline and repression, and as the most effective inculcator of the divinity of the status quo. Okay? The church in its turn puts God's seal of approval on the existing social system, conditioning people from a very early age to see nonconformity as bad and serious rebellion as demonic. The Christian churches and the Western capitalist ruling elites have always worked together as a machine in Foucault's sense that perpetuates and rationalizes the advantage of the few while maintaining the many in a condition of productive repression via ideological control and the channeling of their sexual spiritual energies. Liberation theology began in Latin America with these classic conditions. The wealthy ruling elite supported by conservative Catholic hierarchy, dominating masses of poor people. In 1956, progressive church leaders founded CELAM, the Latin American Bishops' Council, to discuss and counter these conditions with new ideas. And then came Pope John the 13th. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. And his Vatican Council too, which proclaimed the Catholic Church's option for the poor. CELAM met in conference in Medellin, Colombia in 1968 to find ways and means of putting the Vatican II into practice in Latin America. One of the structural ideas emerging from the Medellin Conference was the church-based community where poor people gather in self-managed parishes to discuss religion and help each other with survival problems. In Brazil, particularly, with its large population and great shortage of priests, these base communities spread rapidly. In 1984, there were about 150,000 church-based communities in that country alone, all actively supported by the Brazilian bishops. Brazilian Franciscan and theologian Leonardo Boff, one of the architects of liberation theology, has explained that the Brazilian Catholic Church needs these communities to help it face rapidly growing competition from numerous Oriental and Afro-Brazilian religions, and also from fundamentalist Protestant and Mormon churches that have been sent to Latin America from the U.S. with President Reagan's tactic support. Boff has defended the Catholic-based communities as the most creative way to compete with this pastoral challenge. They are the locus where the people meet together to read the Word of God, celebrate, and put into practice love of neighbor. This is the Church of the Poor in Central and South America. These base communities have spread everywhere among millions of people who traditionally very spiritual and also struggling to survive oppressive conditions, as well as overthrow U.S.-backed political military dictatorships. In Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution, Margaret Randall has shown the strongly inspirational and tactical effect of the Christian-based communities and liberation theology on the people of Nicaragua, who were able to harmonize their religious vision with successful armed struggle against the dictator Somoza and his U.S.-trained National Guard. This is the inspiration of liberation theology among the people, and the threat it poses to the ruling elites. When poor people read the Bible, they interpret Jesus as a social revolutionary, and liberation theologists have interwoven these popular radical interpretations with traditional theology. Boff, in particular, has applied Marxist economic analysis to the hierarchic, conservative, imperialist, socialist hierarchic, conservative, imperialist, social, and religious structures dominating Latin America. In Church, Charisma and Power, written in 1981, he analyzes the Catholic Church from a Marxist perspective as a capitalist institution. For this and his whole range of politically provocative and inspirational thought, Boff was called to Germany in September of 1984 at the Pope's request to be questioned by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the Archbishop of Munich. Ratzinger was put in charge of the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith in 1981 for the express purpose of questioning and disciplining liberation theology. This congregation is what remains in the modern world of the old European Inquisition's infrastructure. The Vatican and conservative Catholic churchmen in Europe and in Latin America have, since the early 70s, joined together to target and denounce Christians for socialism and liberation theology in general, as well as Marxist infiltration in Ceylon. They claim that any use of Marxist economic structural analysis threatens to expand into an atheist Marxist, undermining an atheist Marxist undermining of the human spirit, or at least the church's control over that human spirit. In fact, the church has always seen any analysis of the human condition beyond its own as a great threat to its imperialist hegemony. It created the Inquisition in 1200 to fight heresy, i.e., the Arabic worldview. Later, in 1484, it launched the 300-year-long war on witchcraft, i.e., pagan European worldview. Now, in the mid-1980s, it fights Marxist atheism. In all cases, the church claims to own the true spirit. It pretends biblical textual support for its authority, and it denounces its opponents as heretical and ungodly. But Marxism didn't exist during the Inquisition, nor is it essentially Marxism the church is fighting. It is, in fact, engaged in the same centuries-old secular power struggle against rival social visions as well as rival religions. When it denounces Marxist analysis and the communism of socialist and the communism of socialist, it is truly fighting old Christian of Jesus as a social revolutionary, a vision that is always at the core, a reversion to the pre-Christian paganism. Come on, Christian paganism. Come on. Okay? Because the Bible is not the word of God, but the words of men, of many men, and many times, its text can be used, like Bartlett's quotations, to support just about any argument one is discussing. In Deuteronomy 5:17, Yahweh says, "Thou shalt not kill." In Deuteronomy 2:34 and 7:1 and 1 through 2, in Leviticus 20, 1 through 27, and throughout the book of Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Samuel, and Kings, Yahweh commands that his people kill a long, explicit list of people Yahweh finds offensive. Human sacrifice to idols is divinely condemned. Yet on page after page, Hebrew heroes like Samuel chasten their enemies by annihilating whole villages, butchering pregnant women, infants, and old people, right down to the cows, ducks, and geese. And these melee-type massacres are, we are told, not only condoned by God, but empowered and blessed by him. Which word of God do we listen to in the crazy bowels of the night? By the same token, there is as much biblical textual support for the idea of Jesus as a social revolutionary and the Gospels as a revolutionary's handbook as there is for the maintenance of a hierarchic social system based on wealth and ruled over by a political, religious, military dictatorship in God's name. Margaret Randall's book, in Margaret Randall's book, a Nicaraguan named David speaks, quote, "There cannot be a church of the rich. Christ was the first to accuse the rich, telling them it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven," end quote. One does not need Marxist training or Marxist analysis to see the gospel Jesus as a spiritual and social radical breaking with the traditional hierarchy of his people and of imperialist Rome, denouncing both the wealthy Jewish and Roman ruling classes and their corrupt priesthoods to call the human soul to rebellion against its condition, its false ontological condition, falsely rooted in an anti-spiritual, anti-holistic social order. The Bible, like all large cosmological works of the human mind, gives to us essentially what we come looking for: the authoritarian look for passages promising God's blessings on a fascistic status quo and finds them. The radical seeks confirmation of an active revolutionary vision and finds it. Certainly, there are more than enough New Testament passages illustrating Jesus' radical social mission and his desire to do away with the hardened and corrupt institutions that block and deform the aspirations of the soul, to give textual authority to the liberation theologists in their work. And when it comes to textual authority, we have to remember that the entire establishment, structure, and worldly power of the Roman Catholic Church was based on one joking pun made by Jesus, who said he would build his church on this rock, i.e., the apostle Peter, whose Latin name comes from Petra, meaning a stone. And thus Peter is legendarily the first bishop of Rome, and all the mythic worldly authority of the Vatican derives from this pun. Politics happens when people realize their daily survival problems are not caused by individual sin and guilt, but by a collective malfunctioning. Within patriarchal Christian capitalism, this is the taboo vision. Whether it comes from Albigensian or Cartharite heretics or pagan witches from the 21st century Christian socialist or atheist Marxist, the vision is the same insofar as it is a collective, systemic, revolutionary approach to problems rather than a personal, confessional, therapeutic one. Woo! Oh, so you heard it. Come on. Come on. Okay? Listen. Whether it comes from Albigensian or Cartharite heretics or pagan witches, or from 20th century Christian socialists or atheist Marxists, the vision is the same insofar as it is a collective, systemic, revolutionary approach to problems, rather than a personal, confessional, therapeutic one. While liberation theology and church of the poor activate the first, the political, the approach the church encourages, as it always has historically enforced by law when it could, the latter, personal solution. A solution which, needless to say, keep the church in business. The conservative Catholic and official Vatican view is expressed by the German bishop Franz Hanschbach, who since 1973 has been working through Bogota, Colombia, with conservative Latin American clerics to stamp out the influence of liberation theology and the church of the poor. Hanschbach insists that Christian liberation must be solely personal, a liberation from original sin and personal guilt, not from social structures. While liberation theology seeks to free human beings from decadent and exploitative social economic conditions, the conservative Catholic hierarchy apparently believes that hunger and poverty, forced and unrewarding labor, and massive brutal exploitation by global economic and political forces are to be understood and accepted by humble sinners as God's punishment for their sins. Or at any rate, such conditions are to be patiently endured without revolt, while individual souls concentrate on confessing their personal sins on their knees, never seeking justice or earth, but meekly believing such luxuries will come to them in heaven. Original sin, it seems, is the sin of being poor. Or if not, why don't the rich, the owners, the exploiters, the bosses, the ruling political, religious, and military elites have to suffer in this way? Bishop Hanschbach announced in 1977 the so-called liberation theology leads to nothing. Its consequence is communism. End quote. Hanschbach's opinion was important on the secular, if not the divine level. The poor Latin American Catholic churches depend on funding from the very rich West German churches. And Hanschbach was at the time the president of the German Bishops' Conference, and thus in charge of all of the funding for developmental and pastoral work in poor countries, specifically Latin America. Just before making his pronouncement on liberation theology, Hanschbach had been decorated with the Order of the Condor of the Andes by President Banzer, the dictator of Bolivia. Hanschbach's view of liberation theology is similar to the Chilean dictator Pinochet's view of democracy, which he called the breeding ground of communism. Another major Catholic warrior against liberation theology is the Belgian Jesuit Roger Vekemans, who has denounced it along with the Church of the Poor as a contagious virus. In the mid-1970s, Vekemans had been reported by the Washington Star and the National Catholic Register to have received, in his own admission, millions of dollars in funding from the American CIA and from the Agency of International Development. He had also boasted of advising then CIA Director John McCone to let one or two Latin American countries go communist so that it would then be easy to arouse anti-communist paranoia in the rest of the Western Hemisphere. Come on, y'all are not hearing. For those who have tuned in late, I am reading from The Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth by Monica Zhu and Barbara Moore. So I'll be wrapping up in a few more minutes here. The Catholic Church, as the self-defined owner of true spirit, denounces Marxist analysis as materialistic, and finds liberation theology's emphasis on social economic problems with social economic solutions also abhorrent in its materialism. Apparently, the desire of the world's poor to eat, to feed their children, to clothe and shelter themselves and their children, to live creative lives, to spend their days in meaningful labor rather than in numbing drudgery, to earn a fair reward for their work and a future for their children. Apparently, all this is to be seen as materialism. It can be seen so by the Catholic hierarchy only within the Christian dualistic systems that separates flesh from spirit, and then pretends that the lifelong degradation of one leads to the eternal liberation of the other. Come on. Damn. In fact, suffering of the poor, suffering can and does enlarge the human consciousness, but not within a dualistic, anti-holistic system. Within Christian civilization, the suffering of the poor, generation after generation, has served as little more than the nervous titillation for the well-off. The rich derive a complacent sense of continuous self-justification by muttering, the poor we have always with us, etc., etc., and other selected phrases coming from the Vatican and the Catholic bishops of the wealthy German church, who have all spent most of their lives in a heady atmosphere of pearls, gold, velvet, and good wine. Such a charge of materialism is stunning. If we wonder if any of these princes of the church have spent much time sweating, starving, or shaking with cold, the answer is probably not. Nor is it spirit that clothes their daily lives in perpetual luxury. Rather, they are liberally endowed with the accumulated material wealth of centuries. It isn't the poor people who need redemption, but the fabulously wealthy churches themselves. The only way the Christian institution can redeem itself, come on and listen now. The only way the Christian institution can redeem itself surely is by helping the poor and the persecuted realize equity and justice. Half of the world's Roman Catholics live in Latin America. That is a powerful force. Enormous changes could occur if the Catholic Church, led by the Vatican, removed its holy sanctions from the exploitative systems of the rich and denounced and renounced ruling political, business, and military elites it has helped bring to power and maintain in power for over 450 years throughout Latin America. But papal lip service won't make change happen. Total structural and ideological change is necessary. Liberation theology and the Church of the Poor are such real attempts at real change, and they are being called up to defend themselves before the grim persecutory shadow of the Inquisition. Now, this is the question, and this is how I'm going to end today. Oh my God, can Christianity truly be revolutionary? Can it change its institutional ideological self and thus help change the world? What is Christianity? Insofar as it derives from both biblical testaments, is a set of ontological principles or assumptions that must be confronted on an ontological level by anyone seeking a merger. Come on now. Whew. Seeking a merger of Christian religion and genuine world change. These principles are: one, that the Creator is separate from its creation, therefore does not participate continuously in evolutionary processes. Two, that the Creator is pure spirit, mechanically dichotomized from a creation of impure matter. Three, that human beings have committed a primal sin or crime of disobedience to the will of God. Four, that God has therefore condemned the entire human race to continuous suffering and punishment on an evil earth as expiation for this original crime of our parents in Eden. 5, that to be born, therefore, is to be born in sin, i.e., to be born through the mother who represents the original sin and inherent evil of the flesh. 6, that to survive in a world of sin, the male must dominate nature, while women, as embodiment of that nature and its vessel, must undergo permanent domination. 7, that the only way to be saved from this situation, from life on earth and life after death, both defined as hells ruled by the devil, is through submission to Jesus Christ, who is defined by his religion as the only time in human history of the universe, in the history of the universe, that spirit ever entered into matter, i.e., incarnated. 8, that these principles exist because the world is a mechanically structured dualism of God and the devil, pure good versus pure evil, eternally at war with each other and eternally irreconcilable, in which human life is meaningful only insofar as it functions as a battlefield for these two forces. Human beings must choose one side or the other, but can never transcend the dualisms or resolve them in a holistic consciousness, which was the consciousness forbidden by Yahweh in the Garden of Eden. Since the ontological worldview embedded in these principles is seen by many of us as the cause of the problem, how can radical change occur via these same principles? Y'all better act like y'all hear me out here. You understand what I'm saying? Come on now. She just went through all of the principles. Can the world or Christian civilization be radically changed without radically changing the world's structuring ontology? How can one find a truly revolutionary solution without radically changing the terms and the cosmological assumption of the problem? Okay? Y'all, come on. Mary Daly is one of the few people among feminists or contemporary thinkers in general who has wrestled with this situation at its ontological roots. And she has done so as a feminist in her books Beyond God the Father, Gynecology, and Pure Lust. In Pure Lust, in a section entitled The Courage to Sin, she points out that sin derives from a Latin word meaning to be. The to sin is to be, Sin comes from the Old English SYNN, sin, meaning to sin, with the root word being Old English ES, to be. S, the root of being, is a basic Indo-European root word. Interestingly enough, in Hebrew, the word sin means moon. To sin within the patriarchal religious context of Christianity is to risk being, i.e., within that context, true being can only occur in the renegade spaces outside the established religion, utterly outside and beyond its terms. The Christian dream has already been written from beginning to end. It says that only one life was worth living, and it has already been lived, and it was his. The best believers can hope for the best the best that believers can hope for is an imitation of Christ. Christianity promises to save the human soul, but in fact, Christianity exists by saving humans from the experience of our own souls. If we will forfeit our own mystical journeys through the world, if we will give up the dangerous adventure of discovering and creating our own consciousness and evolution, Christianity will give us in return a script about Jesus. Okay? And this is the only choice Christian ontology offers. One can spend one's life risking the sin of being, or one can submit and spend one's life following a dead script. The tragedy of Christianity is that it has kept untold millions of human beings from sinning, i.e., from knowing their own souls. For it is life that Christianity promises salvation from life directly experienced for the first time without the stale safeguards and blinders of prefabricated script. Upon the machinery of sin and salvation, the whole Christian ontology rests. The figure of Christ that the church is based on is this machinery, i.e., Christ depends on human sin for his very existence. One can say that sin is the food of the Christian church, and it cannot keep eating if it does not keep producing it, producing a definitive vision of a life as sin, as experimental being we must be saved from. If the world has been hell under 2,000 years of Christianity, it can be said to have been so. It can be said to have been so as the result of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Christian machine is not programmed for any other result. So I'm going to stop there for today. We are at the 1.5 hour mark. So for those who are just tuning in, I am reading from The Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth. For those that are tuning in from IG, go to my YouTube page where you can go back to this reading, and you can also go back for the other readings. We are on chapter 47 right now, called The American Split. And I read every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, until we are done with this book. So we still have a good ways to go, though we don't have many chapters, but the chapters are getting really long. So I'm going to stop here in the middle of chapter 47, The American Split, and encourage you to go to my YouTube page, follow, like, share, click the little bell for notifications and all of that jazz. And yeah, so for those who've never seen this reading, one of the things that it is contributing to is the first week in July, I will be conducting a workshop on this book, but I wanted to read the whole book through so that people who may not be, people have lives, and a lot of people don't really sit down and read much these days. And I know we're always on the go. So I was like, well, let me read it live. And that way people can go back and they can listen to the reading while they're driving to work for an hour or whatever. We live in LA, so it's like that, right? Or they can listen to it while they're washing dishes or whatever. The book is important. It is not something that I am doing for my leisure time. It is not something that I am doing to get rich, because that ain't going to happen. You understand what I'm saying? This book is important for the understanding of what it means to change the world, what it's going to take to change the world. And it's not just it's not just going to be your personal affirmations and manifestations in your house on the full moon. It's just not. It's not. So this book is a game changer. It is so prolific and so profound. So I encourage you, go to my YouTube page. If you look in the descriptions of any of the readings of this book, there are links to the PDF version of the book that you can get online for free, or you can order the book, which I encourage you to do, because as you can see, mine is well marked up. You understand? Well used, well read. It's my 4th time reading the book. So with that being said, my name is Cassandra, formerly known as Iyapo Ngina, and also known as the Rogue Black Girl. Look for me right now still as Iyapo, Iyapo, on Twitter, Facebook, and on my YouTube channel. Twitter, Facebook, and IG. Moyende Creations on IG, and also releaseheartcenter on IG. So that being said, I want to thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully you were fed from the reading today. Tell somebody else about the reading. I will see you guys again on Monday. See you later.